I never liked star days. They were supposed to be the colony's saving grace, a brief burst of life in a place where the universe had otherwise forgotten we existed. For a few hours every few years, Gloomrock's orbit would pull us close enough to its dying star to soak in a few precious rays. Everyone waited for it like it was some kind of miracle, but I always thought it felt more like a cruel reminder. That flicker of light, and then it was gone, leaving us stranded in the cold again. I stood at the terminal, adjusting the calibrations on the solar collectors. The system was ancient, cobbled together from whatever parts hadn't already been scavenged or used to keep the colony's infrastructure from collapsing. Just hold together for a few more hours, I muttered under my breath. The collectors hummed, a low, grating sound that always made me uneasy. They'd been temperamental lately. Too many years of patchwork repairs, too little attention from the council. But if the star day happened the way it always did, they'd drink in the light and recharge the reserves. Enough to keep us all alive until the next one. The colony was quiet today. Everyone was waiting. I could feel it in the air. Tension, anticipation. They didn't understand the machines like I did. They didn't know how close we were to everything falling apart. But they had faith, a word I despised. I didn't leave the control room. My life was tethered to these machines, and their life was tethered to me. Every few minutes I'd check the output readings. Nothing yet, just the usual static. In a few more hours we'd begin the delicate alignment process, ensuring the panels were angled just right to catch the first rays of starlight. Time crawled. I strolled across the control room, feeling the constant worry in my gut. It was always like this before a star day. The silence, the waiting, the pressure. The colony depended on it. And me, I depended on the machines. If they failed, we all failed. I checked the system again. Still nothing. The minutes ticked by, and finally, the signal came from the council's broadcast system. "Commence alignment procedures." I let out a breath and pulled the lever, watching as the ancient mechanisms ground to life. Outside, the massive solar collectors would be shifting, groaning as they repositioned themselves. In a matter of minutes, the light would come, and they would drink in the star. Except it didn't. The collectors whirred, the fans kicked in, but the screens remained dark. I felt my heart skip a beat. "No," I whispered, leaning over the console. The readings were static, flat lines across the board. I flicked through the systems, panel integrity, alignment, thermal readings. Everything was showing normal. There should have been light. There was always light. But not this time. The door slid open behind me, and a voice broke the silence. "Owen, any problems?" It was Anders, one of the other engineers. He had that hopeful look on his face, the kind people always wore right before they realized things were worse than they thought. "Something's wrong," I muttered, not bothering to look at him. I kept scrolling through the diagnostic reports. No readings from the collectors. The alignment's perfect, but there's no starlight. He stepped closer, glancing at the screen. "That's impossible. Maybe it's a malfunction." "It's not a malfunction," I muttered, finally turning to him. "The collectors are fine. The problem isn't here." Anders looked confused for a moment, then realization dawned on him. He went pale. "You're saying the star? It's not there." There was a long pause, the weight of my words sinking in. No star, no energy, no survival. The colony's entire existence depended on those few hours of starlight, and if they didn't come, we were dead. All of us. "What do we do?" Anders asked, his voice shaky now. I clenched my fists, feeling a wave of frustration rising. I wanted to scream, to punch something, to make the universe stop playing its cruel tricks, but there was no use. There was never any use. "We need to tell the council," I said, forcing myself to stay calm. "They'll have to figure something out. Maybe there's a backup plan. Maybe we've got more reserves than they're letting on." I didn't believe a word of it, but it was the only thing to say. Anders nodded numbly and turned to leave. As the door shut behind him, I sank into the chair, staring at the dead monitors. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was it. The final straw. We'd been scraping by for too long, relying on old machines and empty promises. Now, the star was finally abandoning us. After a while, I dragged myself out of the control room and into the dim corridors of the colony. People were starting to gather in the common areas, looking up at the overhead speakers, waiting for the council to address them, waiting for good news that wouldn't come. I made my way to the command center, where the council was already assembling. Governor Merrick stood at the front, his arms crossed, his face as cold and unreadable as ever. He looked more like a bureaucrat than a leader, but he'd held on to power for decades through sheer manipulation and control. When he spoke, his voice echoed through the halls. There's been an unexpected issue with the solar alignment. Our engineers are working to resolve it. I could feel my blood boiling. I wanted to shout, to tell everyone that it wasn't a malfunction, that there was no Starlight at all. But I stayed silent, watching as the council spun their lies. People listened, hoping against hope that the problem would be fixed. Merrick continued. In the meantime, we will begin rationing energy. Life support systems will remain operational, but unnecessary power consumption will be restricted until further notice. Rationing. It was always rationing with them, as if cutting a few lights and shutting off the entertainment consoles would save us from what was coming. The crowd began to disperse, murmuring among themselves. The fear was spreading now, but the council had bought themselves a few more hours of calm. As the others left, I caught Merrick's eye. He gave me a brief nod, and I knew I was expected to keep quiet. But how long could I keep this to myself? How long before the colony started to unravel? Back in the lower levels, I walked past the dim corridors, past the faces of the other colonists who still clung to their fading hopes. But I'd seen the way the council operated, how they hoarded power and let the rest of us starve for it. They weren't going to save us. The colony was running out of time, and the darkness wasn't going anywhere. I returned to the control room, staring at the dead monitors again. The collectors were still aligned perfectly, their massive panels aimed at an empty sky. The readings hadn't changed. No light, no energy, no future. I sank into the chair, rubbing my hands over my face. There was no fixing this, no way out. We were stranded, just like always, orbiting a dying star that had finally decided it didn't care about us anymore. The lights flickered overhead, and I felt the cold touch of fear wrap around my spine. This time, it wasn't the machines breaking down. It was everything. And for the first time, I didn't know how to stop it. The Starlight never came. Hours had passed since the star day should have begun, and nothing. No energy. No hope, just empty skies and dead collectors. The Starlight was gone, and it was never coming back. The colony was restless. The rationing announcement from Governor Merrick had pacified the crowd temporarily, but word spread quickly. People weren't stupid. When the light started dimming and the heaters cut off, when the thin air tasted even thinner, they knew something was wrong. I stood at my station, staring at the useless monitors. The collectors were in perfect alignment, still primed to absorb the light that would never arrive. Anders had disappeared, probably off to drink or drown his fears with the others. I didn't blame him. We were all clinging to the same sinking ship. A crowd was gathering in the lower tunnels, angry voices echoing through the halls. I made my way toward the noise, every step filled with dread. People didn't gather in large numbers on Gloomrock unless things were about to get ugly. When I arrived, I saw the first cracks in the fragile shell that kept the colony from devouring itself. 2 men from the lower levels were locked in a vicious struggle. One had the other pinned against the wall, his hands clamped around the other's throat, squeezing with white-knuckled rage. The other flailed wildly, his nails tearing at the attacker's skin, gasping for air. A crowd had gathered, staring with fascination and fear, but no one moved to help. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on, feeding off the desperation that hung over us all like a shadow. I pushed through the crowd and grabbed the one doing the strangling by his arm, yanking him away just before he crushed the man's windpipe. He spun on me, his face twisted in raw panic, eyes wide and unfocused. His chest heaved as he clenched his fists, still ready to fight. He didn't care who he hurt. His mind was too far gone, consumed by the same fear eating at all of us. He just needed to fight something to keep the darkness at bay. "Get off me!" he snarled, trying to pull back, but I held firm. "We can't afford this right now," I said, keeping my voice steady. "We're all in the same hole." The other man, his face bloodied and swollen, spat on the ground and wiped his mouth with his sleeve. "He tried to steal from me. Bastard broke into my quarters, tried to take my rations." He looked around, cornered, ready to lash out again. "Is this what we've come to?" I said, letting the words hang in the air. "Fighting each other over scraps. We're running out of power. You think this is going to help?" The crowd started to disperse, their anger replaced by a simmering fear. They weren't ready to riot yet. Not today. I let go of the man's arm and he slumped against the wall, exhausted. I knew he'd be back here in a few hours, scrapping with someone else. That was the nature of desperation. When I got back to my station, Anders was waiting for me. "You hear what's going on?" I nodded. "People are losing it, fighting over rations." "It's worse than that," he said, voice hushed. "The council, they're rationing oxygen, not just power, they're cutting air to the lower levels." I stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. "They're what?" "Some of the life support systems are offline. I heard a couple of guys from maintenance talking about it. They said it's not an accident. The council's doing it on purpose. Diverting what's left of the air to the upper levels, to themselves." Of course they were. The council had always looked after their own, letting the rest of us fight for the scraps, but cutting air, that was a new low, even for them. "They're going to let us suffocate while they sit up there, breathing easy." Anders continued, his voice rising. "How much longer before people figure out what's really happening? We can't stay quiet about this." He was right, but the council wasn't the kind of enemy you could openly fight. They controlled everything, the energy, the oxygen, the food. Any rebellion would be crushed before it even started. But if we didn't act, the lower levels would suffocate. "We need proof," I said, trying to keep the rising panic from my voice. "If we go around spreading rumors without something solid, they'll turn the colony against us. We need to know for sure what they're doing." Anders nodded. "How do we get that kind of information? You know the council. They keep everything locked down tighter than a vault." I rubbed my temples, thinking. The maintenance logs. If they're diverting oxygen, there's got to be a record. If we can get into the central control room, we might be able to pull the logs and expose them. Anders looked nervous, but he didn't argue. "Central control? We'd need clearance. We've got the tools, we just need the right moment." As I spoke, a part of me realized how dangerous this was. The council wouldn't slap us on the wrist for this kind of trespass. They'd bury us. But I couldn't shake the image of the fight in the tunnels, of men tearing each other apart because the council was pulling their strings. This wasn't survival. It was slaughter. We waited until the night cycle, when most of the colony was asleep. The lights dimmed to conserve what little energy we had left. Anders and I moved quickly, navigating through the tunnels. The control hub was as fortified as I expected. Heavy security doors, automated locks, surveillance. It took us longer than I liked to bypass the outer systems, but we managed to get inside. Anders kept watch as I slid into the terminal. I knew what I was looking for, the life support logs, the air distribution protocols. It didn't take long to find them. A series of commands issued by the council, rerouting oxygen flow from the lower levels to the council chambers and private quarters. The bastards were stockpiling air, cutting it off from the rest of us. Slowly, quietly, so no one would notice until it was too late. I stared at the screen, bile rising in my throat. It was worse than I thought. The numbers didn't lie. In a matter of days, maybe less, the lower levels would be uninhabitable. Suffocation, starvation, a slow, agonizing death. "They're really doing it," Anders whispered, peering over my shoulder. "They're killing us. Not if we stop them first," I growled, downloading the logs onto a portable drive. "We take this to the people. We show them the truth." Anders hesitated. "And then what?" "A riot. A revolution. You think we can win against them?" I didn't know. But I knew one thing for sure. If we did nothing, we were already dead. "We don't have a choice," I said, standing up and pocketing the drive. "We show them this and we let the colony decide, but first we need to stay alive long enough to do it." We turned to leave, but before we could reach the door, I heard a voice. "Going somewhere, gentlemen?" I froze. There, standing in the doorway, was one of the council's enforcers. Anders stiffened beside me, and we both remained motionless. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire, ready to snap. There was no time to think, no time to plan. We were cornered, and there was only one way out. "Run!" I muttered through clenched teeth. Before the word even left my mouth, I bolted. Anders was right behind me. We sprinted through the corridors, the sound of boots pounding the floor behind us. The enforcers were closing in fast, their heavy footfalls echoing in the hallway. Anders was breathing hard, panicking. "They're going to catch us," he wheezed, barely able to get the words out. My legs screamed for relief, but stopping wasn't an option. If they caught us, it wouldn't be quick. I knew how the council handled traitors. I glanced over my shoulder, catching a glimpse of the enforcers closing the distance, their armored bodies cutting through the shadows like predators on the hunt. Ahead, I spotted a maintenance hatch, our only way out. I veered toward it, ripping the panel open and shoving Anders through first. I barely had time to scramble in after him before the enforcers reached the spot where we'd been. I could hear their voices, harsh and frustrated, echoing down the tunnel as they lost sight of us. The narrow maintenance shaft was a hell of confined space and stale air, but it gave us a moment to breathe. I could still hear Anders gasping for breath beside me, and I felt the adrenaline ebbing away, leaving only the edge of fear in its place. "We need to get to the lower levels," I whispered. "The logs. The people need to see what the council's doing." Anders nodded, his face slick with sweat. "They won't stop coming after us. They'll send more enforcers." I didn't need to be reminded. The enforcers wouldn't stop until they hunted us down. That meant we had to move faster and smarter than they expected. We crawled through the cramped shaft, navigating our way deeper into the bowels of the colony. After a while, we finally dropped out of the maintenance shaft into one of the lower tunnels. It was quieter down here, but not peaceful. The telltale signs of the oxygen shortages were everywhere. People huddled in small groups, their bodies thin and weak. They were already suffocating, already dying. And they didn't even know why. I clenched my fists, rage bubbling up inside me. These people were being sacrificed so the elite could breathe easy in their plush chambers above. And no one knew the truth but us. "We need to find somewhere safe," Anders whispered, scanning the area nervously. "They'll be looking for us everywhere." I nodded, but my mind was already elsewhere. We had the data, the proof, but getting it to the right people was another matter entirely. The enforcers wouldn't just stop at hunting us down. They'd control the flow of information, suppress anything that could cause unrest. We needed to be strategic. And then I remembered something I'd hoped to forget: the colony's lower labs. It wasn't a place I liked thinking about. The labs were a graveyard of failed projects, abandoned experiments, and most importantly, secrets. The council had kept the labs under strict lockdown for years, claiming the equipment was too dangerous to operate without proper oversight. But I'd heard the rumors, whispers about what really went on down there. Experiments, human trials, things better left in the dark. "We're going to the lower labs." Anders looked at me like I'd just suggested walking into the abyss. "You're not serious. That place, no one comes back from there. They say the council—" "I know what they say," I cut him off, "but it's the only place they won't expect us to go. And if the rumors are true, we might find more than just proof of what they're doing with the oxygen. We might find out what else they've been hiding." Anders didn't argue. There wasn't time. We moved quickly, sticking to the shadows, avoiding the larger corridors where the enforcers would be sweeping for us. The lower labs weren't far, but it felt like a lifetime before we reached the sealed doors that led to the restricted area. The doors were old, rusted from years of neglect. I pulled out my tools and worked to bypass the locks. The council had kept this place locked down tight, but not tight enough to stop someone like me. After a few tense moments, the lock gave way, and the heavy doors creaked open. My breath fogged in front of me as we made our way through the corridors. The machines here were ancient, forgotten relics of some early phase of the colony's life. Broken down medical equipment, diagnostic terminals with cracked screens, shelves of tools long abandoned to dust. At first, I thought the shadows were playing tricks on my eyes. Shapes, barely recognizable as human, filled the spaces between the machines. Bodies. No, things that had once been bodies. At first glance they seemed human, but the closer I got, the more disturbing they appeared. Twisted limbs, extended spines, skin discolored and warped. They were hooked up to machines, their chests rising and falling in shallow breaths. Some were conscious, their eyes staring at nothing. Others weren't so lucky. Their bodies were contorted, their faces frozen in expressions of pain. "What the hell?" Anders whispered. "They were using them," I said quietly, trying to keep the bile down. "Experimenting. These people, they were probably volunteers once. Maybe they thought they were helping the colony, but the council, they used them." I approached one of the machines, brushing the metal. The terminal next to it flickered weakly, showing a data log. I scanned through it quickly. The council hadn't just been rationing oxygen. They had been experimenting with ways to extract energy from human bodies, using these people as batteries, drawing whatever life force they had left to feed their own survival. This was worse than anything I could have imagined. The council wasn't just killing us, they were draining us, using us like livestock. "We need to get out of here," Anders said, panic rising in his voice. We can't stay here." But I couldn't move. My eyes were locked on one of the bodies. His eyes fluttered open, meeting mine. His lips moved, barely a whisper, but I understood. "Help me." It was a plea, a desperate, broken plea. I reached for him, but Anders grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "We can't, we need to leave." I wanted to argue. I wanted to save them, but Anders was right. There was nothing we could do for them. They were already gone, their lives sucked dry by the council's greed. I pulled away, feeling the guilt settle on my shoulders. We left the labs behind, sealing the doors as we had found them, locking away the horrors inside. But I knew I'd never forget what I saw. None of us would. As we made our way back to the tunnels, I clutched the data logs in my hand. Proof of everything, the oxygen rationing, the human experiments, the council's betrayal. We had everything we needed. But the question lingered in my mind. Even with all this proof, could we really stop them? And more importantly, how much longer could we survive before the council came for us? The enforcers didn't find us in the lower levels, but I knew it was only a matter of time before they tracked us down. My pulse was still racing from the chase, and Anders looked like he was ready to collapse. We were running on borrowed time. Oxygen wasn't the only thing suffocating us, and we still had no idea what to do next. "We can't stay here," Anders whispered, though it came out as more of a rasp. I nodded, scanning our surroundings. The dimming lights overhead made everything feel like it was already decaying, like the colony itself was dying. The data logs were safe in my pocket, but what good would they do us now? The council knew we had them. They'd send more enforcers, more force. This time there wouldn't be a second chance. My mind kept turning over what we'd seen in the lower labs. The twisted bodies, the human batteries, the council's grotesque experiments. Those people had been nothing more than fuel. The same could be said for the rest of us. But why? What did the council gain from all of this? The experiments, the oxygen rationing, the endless cycle of suffering. It felt too orchestrated. None of it made sense. "There's something we're missing," I said. Something bigger than the council hoarding power. Anders didn't respond. He was staring down the tunnel, his face pale and his body slumped. His eyes were glazed over, but not with exhaustion. It was something else. Fear, or maybe something beyond that. "Hey, stay with me," I said, shaking his shoulder. He blinked, snapping out of whatever trance he'd been in. "I thought I heard something," he muttered. "Like voices, but I can't tell where they're coming from." I stared at him for a long moment, then listened closely. The tunnels were silent. But now that he mentioned it, I felt something too. Not voices exactly, but a kind of pressure in the air. A vibration, almost, like something was humming beneath the surface, too faint to register consciously, but impossible to ignore once you were aware of it. "Let's keep moving," I said, pulling him up. We stumbled through the tunnels, heading deeper into the colony. I didn't know where we were going. We had no plan, no safe place to hide. But that vibration, whatever it was pulling me forward, and as we went deeper, it got stronger. The tunnels opened up into a large maintenance sector. The hum was more intense here, and I could feel it thrumming beneath my feet, like the whole colony was vibrating at some imperceptible frequency. I saw an old access terminal tucked away in the corner of the room. It looked ancient, covered in dust and grime. But what caught my attention wasn't the terminal itself, it was the faint light on its screen. It was still operational. "What is this place?" Anders asked. "I don't know. But something's still active here." I approached the terminal, wiping off the dust from the screen. The display was glitching, distorted, but still functional. I keyed into the system, trying to access whatever data was still stored in it. The screen lit up with a burst of data, long strings of code, unfamiliar symbols, strange anomalies in the system. I scrolled through the information, realizing I had stumbled upon something that wasn't meant to be seen. At first it looked like gibberish, long strings of code that seemed disconnected from anything I'd seen in the colony's systems. It wasn't related to the power grids or life support. No references to oxygen levels or energy reserves. Just strange, fragmented data, like a heartbeat pulsing beneath the surface of our world. I kept digging, bypassing firewalls and encrypted files that had no reason to exist in a colony like ours. The deeper I went, the more unsettling it became. There were commands, subtle, buried, and unlike anything that should be operating behind the scenes. Layers upon layers of hidden protocols, controls running beneath the colony's everyday systems. And then something clicked. A pattern. A hidden subroutine guiding every process, every function, down to the smallest decision. My breath caught as the lines of code began to unravel, revealing the true architecture beneath it all. A single word threaded through the chaos embedded in the system's core. Simulation. I scrolled further, digging through the layers of encryption. The further I went, the more disturbing the information became. It was all there, every detail of Gloomrock's history, every event, every decision, every tragedy. All of it controlled, monitored, adjusted. None of it was real. This can't be right," I muttered, my voice cracking. But the data was irrefutable. Gloomrock wasn't a real planet. It was a simulation, a closed system designed to test us. Every moment of our lives, every breath we'd taken, it had all been part of an experiment. A controlled environment, monitored and manipulated. Anders was shaking his head in disbelief. No, that's not possible. This is a mistake. We're real. He gestured around wildly. "This is real!" I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that we had control over our lives, that the rebellion we'd been fighting for meant something. But the truth was right in front of me, staring back at me from the terminal screen. "Gloomrock was never real," I said, my voice weak. Anders sank to the floor. "But why? Why would they do this to us?" I kept scrolling through the logs, searching for anything that could explain why we had been trapped in this prison, why we had been fed the lie of survival on a dying planet. And then I found it. Control Group Number 37, Behavioral Analysis of Human Response to Terminal Resource Depletion. We were an experiment, nothing more than data points in a larger study. Whoever had created this simulation wanted to see how far humans could be pushed, how we'd react when faced with the slow, inevitable death of our world. The Council, the Enforcers, even the people we'd fought to protect, they were all part of it. The rebellion, the suffering, the fights for survival, they had all been engineered. We were the rats in the maze, running in circles while our unseen captors watched from above. My hands clenched into fists, rage boiling up inside me. Everything we'd done, everything we'd fought for, it had all been for nothing. Every sacrifice, every death, meaningless in the face of the calculated purpose behind it all. The terminal buzzed with a final line of text. Simulation nearing completion, preparing for reset. It hit me like a punch to the gut. They weren't just observing us, they were preparing to wipe the simulation clean, start it all over again. We would lose everything. Our memories, our lives, everything we'd experienced would be erased in an instant. They would reset us, start the experiment anew, and we'd be none the wiser. Anders looked up at me, his eyes wide with terror. We have to stop it. There has to be a way to stop the reset. I disconnected the terminal, tearing out the data drive with all the information I had uncovered. If there was any way to stop the reset, it would be buried somewhere in that data. Somewhere in the tangled web of lies we'd been living. "Come on," I said, pulling Anders to his feet. "We're getting out of here." We stumbled through the tunnels, the hum intensifying. The entire colony was vibrating, like the simulation was on the verge of collapse. The walls seemed to ripple, flickering in and out of focus as the system destabilized. The closer we got to the surface, the worse it became. As we reached the main atrium, the walls wavered, then vanished. The floor beneath us rippled, and the sky above dissolved into nothingness. The entire colony blinked out of existence, replaced by a vast, empty space. I could see it now. The edges of the simulation, the boundaries of our prison. Beyond them, there was nothing. We stood there, suspended in the darkness, our world unraveling around us. And I knew, in that moment, that there was no escape. The reset had already begun. The colony, our lives, everything we'd known, it was all fading, and I was powerless to stop it. There was nothing left to fight for, nothing left to save. We had been pawns in a game we could never understand, and now that game was ending. I looked at Anders, his complexion drained in the dim light of the collapsing simulation. He was shaking, filled with disbelief. But I wasn't afraid anymore. There was nothing left to fear. In the end, there was only darkness,